everybody. So today John is actually at work. He is out doing a film festival for the entire weekend, so you get just me again. But I'm going to answer questions because we've done not a lot of question answering on the vlogs lately, and I think I missed that. So I'm going to try to dig through a bunch of the older ones that we have that haven't made it through to the blog yet. So this might be your day if you feel like your question hasn't been answered for a while. Our first one says, what do you think about people using unusual alteration to turn themselves into trees or animals? How does that function differently from animal form and other shapeshifting boons? And the main way that it functions differently is just that you are still a human, or not a human, a god, whatever, that looks like a tree, not actually a tree. So if you shapeshift with unusual alteration into a tree, you will look like a tree perfectly in every possible way. But you will still be made of, your normal stuff. You're not going to be actually, made of bark. You can simulate bark with your unusual alteration. You can simulate anything you want. But at the base level, you're not actually a plant. You're still a person. And depending on what it is, fertility boons aren't going to work on you because you're not actually a plant. Animal boons aren't going to work on you if you're not actually an animal. And that goes both ways. So, if you turn yourself into a cat, you're not going to be able to talk to cats if you don't actually have animal boons for cat. Because the cats will, you won't actually speak cat. There are also some smaller things, like most of those boons in things like animal and fertility actually give you bonuses beyond just looking like that thing. So for example, using animal form to turn into an animal, if you transformed yourself into a hawk, animal form has a clause where if you take damage that would kill the hawk, you simply take one egg and you revert to your normal self. So it's kind of like a free skin shedding, or almost free, one egg skin shedding. If you use unusual alteration, you don't get that. You're not losing your physical stats, probably, depending on your storyteller's ruling on what exactly you turned yourself into. But you will still take normal damage without having that clause to back you up. And the same thing, people using Dryad Link to make themselves lots of tree parts are going to have the bonuses of Dryad Link. And if you're using unusual alteration, you won't get those. You'll turn into basically the same thing they're turning into, but it will work slightly differently mechanically. And depending on the situation, either one might work a little bit better for you. It's also... Oh shoot, I had a thought about it and I completely lost it. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. So we'll move on to the next question. Hopefully that covered most of that. Yeah, it'll be mostly, and different things will let people see through it, stuff like unfailing recognition can always see through whatever you did that tells them that you're not originally a tree. But some other things, having fool me once will only work to see through illusion. It wouldn't work to see through actually turning into a tree versus, real McCoy. There's different, levels of what happens and how you interact with other people, depending on what powers you used. So our second question... Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, mass. We would consider that using something like unusual alteration, you would want to have the same general close to around the right amount of mass as your normal self. So, for example, if you are a 5-foot-tall person... we probably wouldn't let you use unusual alteration to turn yourself into a 100-foot-tall tree, especially one that is tree-sized, because there's just not enough of you to make a 100-foot-tall tree. You can make a tree that is close to the size of you, and we'd let you fudge it for cool stunts and stuff. We'd be like, you're a 5-foot-tall person, you turn into a 7-foot, 8-foot-tall tree, maybe, but you're not going to be able to be a redwood, because there's just not enough of you to become that. It's an area that the boon doesn't, or the knack doesn't specifically cover exactly how mass works there, and we wouldn't want it to get too scientific and be like, well, you can only go X% above your normal mass, because that would be kind of lame. We want there to be room for there to be cool stunts and stuff, but we're totally cool with you can grow extra parts out of your body or whatever, but we're not cool with you being like, well, I want to quintuple my size. That's gaining advantages that the knack isn't meant to give you, and gets into a weird area where the storyteller starts having to come up with new effects that this knack does that it's really not intended for. So I guess the main difference would be if you're a 5-foot-tall person, you can't use unusual alteration to turn into a blue whale unless it's a very tiny blue whale, and it will look exactly like a tiny blue whale, but it wouldn't be the giant blue whale. You need to actually have whale for that. So that's another consideration to have in there if you want to turn into things that are outside your normal size range. So our second question. Somebody asks, Brahma seems so powerful, and yet he has so few associated purviews and epics. What's up with that? How do you reconcile what the gods can do and how important they are in myth with how they're mechanically represented in Scion's fluff? I think there's an important thing that we need to talk about first, which is associations and the power level of a god, and the fact that they actually don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. And I know that's difficult to like internalize from a role-playing game perspective, because we would all be like, well, if I had more XP and was more powerful, I'd have more epics and purviews, so obviously it's the same for the gods, but it isn't necessarily. Brahma doesn't have a lot of purviews because he only does very specific things, but that doesn't mean that he's not powerful. It just means he's very specialized. Those are the things he does them better than anybody else in his pantheon, possibly anybody else in the universe. And there is no way that he is less powerful than other gods simply because he has fewer purviews that he specializes into. It's the same thing with the Greeks. You'll see that they have tons fewer purviews than a lot of things, and that's because Greek mythology tends to specialize their gods and say this god is god of this one specific concept instead of something huge like all fertility or all water. They say no, he does one thing specifically, and then he only needs one purview for that. And that doesn't mean that he's less powerful than somebody like Odin who has 9,000 purviews. Well, necessarily. A lot of people are less powerful than Odin, but that they're different. So you wouldn't say, well, Zeus is obviously less powerful than Odin because he has fewer purviews, because really, Zeus is just more specialized in what he does than Odin is. And they're both powers to be reckoned with who can probably compete with one another. And part of the idea that having fewer purviews means you must have less power as a god comes from the idea that as players, we all come in looking at things as if we had XP. And we're like, well, the more powerful you get, the more XP you get, and therefore the more stuff you get on your sheet. But gods don't actually get XP. They're there in the beginning of the setting. What they have and what they do is based on what they do in mythology, not on a mysterious point scale that you guys don't get to see. So Brahma having fewer purviews and epics doesn't mean that he got less XP and is less powerful than other gods in his pantheon. It just means those are the specific things he does and represents, and that any ST that is paying attention is going to play him as just as powerful and dangerous as other gods if the situation comes up. So don't panic when you're like, well, I see this god that I really like, and he, Zeus looks like he's totally not powerful. He doesn't have any purviews. Brahma looks like he's totally not powerful. That's not the case at all. They are powerful. They're just not powerful by spreading out. They're powerful by focusing to a point. And they're more likely to have, super relics that specifically buff those things that they do, so that it's not, they can't compete because they don't have lots of powers. It's that in the realm of their specific powers, they're almost unbeatable. So, and that, leads into the second half of the question. Sometimes it's hard to reconcile how important a god is in mythology with how Scion has to represent them. You look at people like Odin and you say, okay, Odin is really important in Norse mythology, but is Scion's method of representing that by giving him associations, making him more powerful than gods who should be equivalent levels from other cultures? And a lot of that is just on the storyteller to, make sure that you play those gods as equivalently powerful, that they can do the things they need to do, that they're not hamstrung. Again, you don't have to pretend that they're players, because they're not players. They don't get XP, they're not hamstrung by the things that players have to pay attention to. So you have to kind of make sure that you give them their fair shake and their time in the sun without being too worried about that mechanical, oh, well, he only has 2 purview avatars, so he's going to lose. That's not necessarily the case at all, ever. And really, it's never the case. Like, even gods that are, not even the same power level might sometimes defeat each other. Like, because it's not always about how many tricks you have in your bag, it's about which ones you use at what time. God combat has gotten to the point where it's so huge that, like, who does what when at the beginning of the fight sometimes decides it long before there's any chance for somebody to use a whole bunch of different powers that their opponent doesn't have. So, plan your stuff out. Don't panic. If Brahma is incredibly powerful, which he is, you don't need to worry that Brahma's going to not be powerful enough because he has fewer purviews than Vishnu. Brahma and Vishnu are probably pretty equivalent in power. That's what the Trimurti is all about. So play them that way, and it should go fine. Our third question, somebody asks, what would you think of a character, a Japanese Scion or other, who tries to model themselves off an anime character? And I think that that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. I think that you probably outgrow it pretty quickly, at least especially after you get out of the Scion hero level. We actually had a character kind of like that. Saki started out as basically a traditional magical girl anime character, and she turned into what she is now, so that didn't last very long. But there's nothing wrong with, like, because we all kind of do those things. We build our characters based on certain archetypes that we've seen in fiction or in film or in whatever we have access to, whatever kind of stories we do, because that's kind of the grand tradition of mythology, that all of our stories kind of go back to those original stories of myth. So, a lot of animes are based on either cultural stories and stereotypes or actual mythology from various places. Anime especially loves to appropriate mythology from all kinds of cultures and then do weird Japanese stuff to it. So there's nothing wrong with starting out being like, I want to play a character that's a lot like Naruto. That's fine. You probably won't stay a lot like Naruto for very long, because hopefully you'll come up with your own new stuff. If you do stay like Naruto forever, you may want to look into, how does this character grow? How can I become something new and interesting? just because you want to make it your own character. You don't want to play somebody else's character forever. That's kind of, it's fun to start with, but, what are you going to turn into? What are you going to become as a god? Most of those characters aren't gods, so how do you make that new leap into new territory? What do you add to it, the character that's completely your own? How do you make it cool? But there's nothing wrong with starting out with an anime character or any other kind of basic character. You can also start out with a comic book character or anything like that. It's just all about what you want to start out with to play and have fun, and then where you take it and how you make it your own later. Our fourth question, I am blowing through these questions, man. Our fourth question is, what does the Sentinel going rampant look like? If a god with an avatar of the Guardian purview gets killed, I can't imagine the consequences. And it's true, the Sentinel going rampant was going to look different from, like, the General going rampant or the Devourer going rampant, because those are pretty classic, like, the Devourer goes rampant, probably going to be volcanoes and flame everywhere, and everything's going to be decimated. That's easy. The Sentinel, because it's Guardian, and Guardian is usually not dangerous, like, the whole point of the Guardian purview is that it's not dangerous, that it protects from danger. The Sentinel looks a little bit different. And different storytellers are going to play avatars differently, so, don't feel like you have to play it the way we would. But the fact that the purview is meant to protect and to defend and guard doesn't necessarily mean that its avatar going rampant is going to be good for everybody. For example, because the purview is a lot about protecting areas and places from things, it may be that when the Sentinel goes rampant, if a god with it dies, everything in that area no one can any longer get in or out, because the Guardian is just blocking it, has like cut that area off to guard it theoretically. But no one can get out, no one can get in. It's been isolated. It is under the dome, for you Stephen King fans. It's also possible that it would do things like, for example, if the person who had the Sentinel had an ancestral enemy they always defended against. Like, this is Huitzilopochtli, and he's really all about fighting against the Tsutsumime, the star demons. Any star demons in that area might get forcefully ejected, like shot out into space. Or anybody that had any connection to stars might suffer consequences of getting knocked out of the area, getting locked down so they can't move or can't take actions, getting their purviews nullified, especially Psychopomp and Chaos are very vulnerable to this because they're kind of Guardian's natural enemies. And the Sentinel also might do something crazy, like if the person who died was trying to defend certain people, it might defend them in a way that is kind of not really in their best interests. Like, if we're trying to defend these people, maybe they all suddenly get encased in, like, metal forever, so nothing can get at them or hurt them, but obviously it's not great for them either, right? So it really depends on, what's happening and how your storyteller plays it, but the Guardian avatar, that's John trying to find out what I'm doing because he's not home. The Guardian avatar is not going to be safer, a thing that explodes, than something like fire. It's just going to take very different effects and how it completely fucks up the landscape. And then our fifth question, I've lost track. It says, Code of Heaven says the Orisha are against slavery, yet Shengo has slaves. Can you explain? I can't explain, and it's not Shengo's fault, it's our fault. When we originally wrote Code of Heaven, we were using the Loa, and we obviously are using the Orisha now. And the Loa, in their modern forms, are actively violently anti-slavery, which shouldn't be a surprise because they're the gods of people who were taken as slaves from their homelands, forced to work in slavery for people in foreign lands, and then eventually fought and won their freedom and guard it very jealously. So it made a lot of sense for those to be gods who would not tolerate slavery at all in any form. But the original African cultures that they came from, where the Yoruba gods are from, actually did have slaves, like most ancient cultures did. There would be, you could buy slaves who were either poor and impoverished members of your own culture, and then they would work for you, or you could buy slaves from other cultures, very similar to, the Egyptians had slaves, the Greeks had slaves, everybody had slaves at some point, pretty much. And the Yoruba also had slaves, and so a lot of those stories you'll see, Obatala has a disobedient slave that appears in a lot of his stories, Shango has slaves, Ogun doesn't really have slaves because he's probably killed them all, but he probably could if he wanted to. So, in that case, since we have updated, it's just a case of we didn't remember to go back and fix that justice boon. And you're probably right. Slavery should probably not be on there anymore, just because the Orisha are a long-running pantheon like the other pantheons, and so that very modern idea may not resonate with all of them. So some of them may be very, very anti-slavery. I would say maybe Ogun is probably anti-slavery at this point because he was kind of like the patron of the slave revolts of Haiti, and he's probably not cool with it anymore. But somebody like Shango, who's been king forever and who thinks of slaves as part of his wealth and his due as the monarch, he's probably fine with it. So we will work on replacing that with something new and better. But in the meantime, feel free to figure out which people amongst the pantheon would care about slavery as a problem, which ones wouldn't, and don't consider it something they can all punish indiscriminately with Code of Heaven. Next question, do the social sciences belong in the science ability? We've actually gone back and forth on that one. We used to put them in there. We had some people who had like science economics and stuff like that. And we've actually recently moved towards saying no, I think not. Not because we don't want people to be able to specialize into things like economics. We totally do. But because those things are more efficiently covered already by academics and politics. Like, we couldn't really justify making somebody buy science economics if he had 5 politics and 5 academics. Like, he should already know that. And it's a similar story for, stuff like sociology or psychology. Those are kind of, they're studies of humanity. So if you have high amounts of politics or empathy, you should be able to pull those off. So most of the time we would say no. Don't feel like you need to buy specialized sciences for the social sciences, but do abide by your storyteller's rulings. If they say, this is a hard science, I think it belongs more in the realm of sciences, then don't argue with them. That's their call as the storyteller. And some storytellers may want to keep social sciences in there to differentiate between like empathy as being able to deal with people, but psychology as like the scientific knowledge of how to deal with people, and that's fine too. For simplicity's sake, we've just stopped doing that. But, there's merits to both ways of doing it. And our last question for the day is a nice simple one. Somebody asked, may I use the name Ian Jupiter, not the character, just the name, for my story? I want to make a reincarnated Scion of Zeus. Yeah, totally do that. We don't care. As long as you're not planning to publish and make money off of him, then we don't care. Use him for your stories, use him for your games, do whatever you want with any of the stuff on our site. It's there kind of both to show what we're doing in our games and keep track of it for our players, but also if you guys want to use it as inspiration for something, that's completely cool. Don't care. I would point out that Ian is kind of a weird name for a reincarnated Zeus, just because it's the Welsh form of John. It's a very Anglical name. But, if you want to use it, go to town, whatever. We don't mind. And that is all the questions for today. I busted them out rapid fire, so if you want to talk about them in the comments, feel free. And hopefully next week we'll have John back, and he won't be exhausted anymore, and we will get you with even more questions. So, oh, and I want to let you guys know, hopefully industry soon done? Maybe? I don't know. It depends on our editing process, but we're working on it. Hopefully soon. And also, to those people who suggested they wanted the order changed on the pronunciation page that we put up a week or two ago, since a lot of people seem to be confused by the way the order was right now, I'll probably go through and do that change sometime today. So don't worry, I will be changing that, and everything will be hopefully more readable for everybody concerned. So have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you next time.